During this pandemic, I'm guessing you've probably gotten a lot of chance to watch some Netflix. How many have watched a lot of Netflix? Yes, okay, good. That's okay. It's all right. I mean, there was a lot of shows to watch, and some of you had a lot of time to watch them. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that people tend to fall into roughly two different categories when it comes to movies. Either you like action, explosion, and adventure, or you like love and redemption and relationships. Maybe that's just the division in my house. I don't know. Comedy? I didn't even think about comedy. That doesn't factor into my sermon this morning, so we're not going to talk about that. How many of you love a good Hallmark movie? Yeah. All right. I'm happy to see some guys. You're willing to raise your hand too. You know what happens is that my wife sometimes, she likes comedies, but sometimes she'll watch one of these movies that's kind of, I would call it a chick flick. I know that seems sort of derogatory, but, and I'll walk by and I'll look, what are you watching? Oh, okay, and then I'll move to the other room, and then as I go by the next time, I'm like, so they're back together again? And then I keep going, and then the next time I walk here, I'm sitting on the edge of the sofa, and before you know it, I'm at the end of the movie like, oh my goodness. They got together in the end. Nothing wrong with a good love story. The story of Ruth is perhaps the greatest love story in all of the Bible. And it contains all of the elements of a great story: friendship, tragedy, death, trust, love, sex, triumph, and ultimately redemption. It's the story of God's redemption of ordinary people through extraordinary means. And what I'm going to do is invite you to be a part of this story, because we have characters in the story. We'll get to meet them in a second. But really, you are a character in this story. And you're going to write yourself into this story. We're going to make some observations and see where you fit into the story. And then at the end, we'll ask one very important question. So, looking at chapter 1, a little overview. There are 4 chapters of this book. It's a short book. And there are 3 main characters. The first one is Naomi. Everybody say Naomi. Naomi is the mother-in-law. The next character is a guy named Boaz. What a great name. Just don't meet a lot of Boazes these days. Everybody say Boaz. Okay, he is the guardian. He is the hero in many ways. The last character, of course, is who the book is named after, Ruth. Everybody say Ruth. Ruth. Now, the story opens on a family trying to survive. Naomi and her husband are in the middle of a famine in the land of Israel, in that area. And so they move their family over to an area called Moab. All right, so not Israel. They move out of Israel to Moab. And there her 2 sons go and they find wives. So let's look at chapter 1, verse 3. It says, "But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, not Oprah. Orpah, it looks like Oprah. And the name of the other, Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. Now listen to this. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband." Okay, so crazy. They moved to this other area to try to find a better life for themselves. The sons get married, but then the husband dies and the 2 sons died. And then you're left with the mother-in-law and the 2 daughters-in-law. Tragic, if you think about it. Now, Naomi hears, this is after 10 years, that things are better back in her homeland. And so she's going to go back to Bethlehem, and she urges her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, to stay in Moab. She's going to go and go back to her homeland, but she says to her daughters, you stay in Moab. But they don't want to. They want to go. And in that moment, Naomi says something that indicates where her heart is at. Look at verse 13. It says, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. The first thing you need to know about this character, Naomi, is that her circumstances have made her very resentful. She lost her husband, she lost her 2 sons, and she has nothing. And I really don't blame her. I mean, do you blame her? Think about that. Her dream would be that her 2 sons, her pride and joy, would find wonderful wives. They did, and that they would live happily ever after, and then she lost all of that. Have you ever lost a dream? Maybe it was a person you thought you were going to marry and spend the rest of your life with, and it didn't work out. And you said, God, why did you do this to me? The way Naomi said it was, why did you turn your hand against me? But you might have said, God, why did you do this to me? Why did you let this happen to me? Maybe it was the loss of a loved one. Maybe the loss of a career dream. Maybe you thought you were going to retire and things changed in the market and your dreams were dashed. Do you become resentful? Do you become like Naomi? You know, when everything goes wrong, it's easy to try to blame somebody, and God is often a convenient target of our blame. Sometimes life is beautiful. Sometimes life is peaceful. Sometimes it's filled with joy. But other times it's unpredictable. It's painful and very unfair. Sometimes you get dealt a great hand in life, and sometimes you don't. Now, what I like about Ruth is that she doesn't blame God, and everything was taken from her as well. One thing you have to remember, in this culture, if you're a woman and you have no husband, it's a very difficult life. It's not like you could just go out and get a job or have a career or raise your family on your own. In this culture, you had very little access to work. Your best bet was to find a husband of some kind, and that would be difficult, especially in the climate of famine in the land. But here's where Ruth shows her heart, her spirit. She says a very famous line. You might be familiar with it. This is in verse 16. But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." Now that's a daughter-in-law. That's the kind of friend you need. Now you might be thinking to yourself, boy, I wish I had a friend like that. But the better question might be, am I that kind of friend to other people? If you want that kind of friend in your life, you need to be that kind of friend to somebody else who says, listen, no matter what happens, I am at your side. I love the way Ruth put it. She says, may the Lord do to me, if anything but death parts me from you. She was committed to Naomi. Here's the thing, where Naomi became resentful, Ruth became resilient. And that is a hard characteristic to find. That's a hard characteristic to find, I think, in our culture. I don't know what happened. Maybe it's just my own vantage point on the world, or maybe I'm getting older and cynical, but it just feels like resilience is a lost art. And I say that even in my own life. I want to give up on things very quickly. But Ruth was not like that. She was ready to stick to the very end, and you're going to see how that pays off. So Ruth is not ready to give up, and she has an idea. Now, Naomi has this relative of high standing, and he owns some grain fields. And so Ruth is going to go to these grain fields, and she's going to glean in those fields. Let's look at chapter 2, and let's look at verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and happened to come to the part of the field belonging to who? Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Now let me explain gleaning, because this is important. If you were poor, if you had no means to support yourself, what you could do is you could go into a field, and while the harvesters were walking along, and they would have a big sickle, and they would be chopping this grain, this barley, and kind of putting it into big, I think they called sheaves or something. Obviously, some of that grain would just fall on the ground as they were going. And the poor in the area would be able to walk behind them and just pick up little bits and pieces of the grain and just put them. Okay, so they weren't harvesting. They were just picking up whatever was left over. And what's interesting is this is a provision in the Old Testament from way back where God says, let those people have some access to what's left over in your field. As a matter of fact, God asked them to leave just a corner of the field unharvested for the poor. So Ruth goes into this field, and she just happens to end up in this field of Boaz, and Boaz arrives, and he notices her, and he pays special attention to her. Look at verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter." He's saying that because she's a part of Naomi's family, right? And Boaz is related to her husband who had passed away. So she's in the family. "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women." So he's saying, okay, don't go to another field. This is your field. I'm going to watch out for you. And she turns around and says, well, why have I found special favor? Like, why would you do this for me? And he gives the answer in verse 11. Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." That's an important idea, wings. You can circle that. We're going to come back to that. So basically what Boaz says is, I've heard about you. I've heard about your resilience. Your reputation has preceded you. Now that's important because think about it. In our culture today, reputation is very important. It's almost all of what social media is about. What do people think of me? And if you're a young woman like Ruth, many things could have been said about you. And you know how people are, and you know how women sometimes get towards other women. Very derogatory, very mean sometimes, could be saying things that are hurtful, could be making up lies. I'm sure there are other women who had their eyes on Boaz. But what is Boaz here? Oh, no, Ruth, she's resilient. She left her homeland to come to Israel. She left her people to be a part of our land. She left her gods to worship our gods. And Boaz says, that's interesting. I know all about you. It's interesting because this is something that we all need to work for, our reputation, but we don't do it by projecting it out there into the world. That seems like how you do it. You make your reputation by simply living a godly life and then letting people notice it. The book of Proverbs, chapter 22, verse 1, I'll put it up on the screen. A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver or gold. It's better for your reputation to precede you than it is for you to be wealthy or to have all the things you want. This is an important concept. Now, there's some back and forth. There's obviously a spark between them. He likes her. She likes him. And as we get to chapter 3, Ruth and Naomi, they make a move. They come up with a little bit of a plan. Here's what happens. At the end of the harvest season, all of those harvesters would take all those sheaves of grain and they would bring them up to a place high on a hill that was flat, and it was called the threshing floor. And what they would do is they would separate the stalk from where the wheat or the barley was, but around that wheat or barley kernel was something called the chaff. If you've seen wheat, you know what I'm talking about. And they would sort of beat on it to try to separate it, and then they would take a shovel or a pitchfork and they would throw it high into the air, and the wind would carry the light chaff away, and the grain, which was heavier, would fall down. Now, this was a big deal. The threshing floor, it was a place of celebration. It was where they were collecting and saying, look at what we have to sell. Look at the blessing of God. There would be drinking. There would be food. It was a party. But here's what's interesting about it. Women were not allowed on the threshing floor. It was a place for men. Now, that's important when you read this next part of the plan. Look at chapter 3, verse 3. This is Naomi telling her daughter-in-law Ruth to do this. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, all that you say, I will do. This is interesting. Naomi's plan is against what is commonly thought of as appropriate. She wants Ruth to get herself done up, look good, smell good, dress up, sneak over to the threshing floor where she's not supposed to be, wait until Boaz has had his meal and has had his drink. Presumably, maybe he's a little bit buzzed, feeling good. When he goes to sleep, sneak in, lie down at his feet, and uncover his feet. Like, take the blanket off of his feet. Now, she does this exactly. And, of course, Boaz wakes up. Look at verse 8, chapter 3. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet, the last thing he's expecting to see. He said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your what? Wings over your servant, for you are my Redeemer. This is such an important biblical concept. So in the Old Testament, there was provision made for a woman who would have lost her husband. It was very common. Because the writers of the Bible and God understood that it would be very difficult for a woman to provide for herself. If she lost her husband, the next in line, whether it was her brother or a cousin or an uncle, somewhere on the groom side of the family, would then marry her to provide for her, and she would also then maybe have a son that would keep the family name going. So this was a provision. It was essentially a responsibility of the next in line to marry her, to provide for her. And that's known as the Redeemer. That's where the phrase Redeemer comes from. I will take you in. I will redeem you. If you are familiar with the the King James Version, it was called the kinsman redeemer. In the New International Version, it says the family guardian. Because he was related to Elimelech, he was in line to be the redeemer to Ruth, and this is a symbolic gesture that Ruth is making. She uncovers this blanket and basically says, I want your blanket, I want your wings to cover me. I want you to be my husband. This is a marriage proposal, straight up. Now, here's what's interesting. What's more telling about this event is not Ruth's character, but Boaz's character. If you were to read a lot about this, there's a lot of people that have taken this move by Ruth to be kind of sort of a salacious, saucy move, that it maybe involved sex at some level, but I don't believe that is at all the case. It doesn't match up with any of the characteristics of this story and other usages of this language. It is simply a symbolic gesture to say, cover me with your wings, just as God covers his people with his wings, as we saw. What's telling about Boaz's character is he had every opportunity to take advantage of her. Remember, he might have been a little bit buzzed. It was dark. Nobody knew she was there. It is not uncommon for men of power to take advantage of women who have less power. Am I right? But Boaz doesn't do that. Boaz is respectful. Boaz is respectful. See, Ruth is taking a big risk here. You have to understand, she doesn't exactly know what kind of man he is. He could have taken advantage of her. But it's her great faith, and it's part of what makes her a hero of faith, to go there and put herself out there. He will not take advantage of this widowed woman. He actually guards her reputation by saying, okay, sneak out of here. I don't want anybody to see you. Don't go now because it's not safe in the middle of the night. But as soon as morning comes, get on out of here. And this is what he says, I'm going to do everything that you asked, but I'm going to do it the right way. Look at verse 10 in chapter 3. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. Now, there's a little bit of a challenge here. We'll get to that in a second. But you have to see, again, the reputation's important. Boaz realizes that she is a woman of high character and she deserves the best treatment. And he says, I want to honor the system by doing things the right way. And men and women listening here and men and women watching here, I want you to know this is a huge application point for us today. The question is, when it comes to relationships, when it comes to sex, are we willing to do things the right way? Or will we take shortcuts and, in a sense, take advantage of other people and their weakness? Would have been easy for Boaz to take advantage of Ruth. By the way, it would have been easy for Ruth to take advantage of Boaz too. That has certainly happened in the Bible. She could have thrown herself at him. She could have seduced him maybe to the point where he couldn't resist. But she didn't do that either. The reason that these people are heroes is because they put aside their own desires and put God's desires first. So, young couples, if you're watching or if you're listening or if you're sitting here, I want to challenge you to do things the right way. I want to challenge you to do things God's way. I know culture says that is old-fashioned. You know what? Truth is never old-fashioned. Truth never goes out of style. Truth is truth all the time. And it's interesting because you're kind of starting to see every once in a while some people saying, you know what? Maybe I should have listened to what God said. One of the best examples is Justin Bieber. He's recently been finding his faith again, and this is what he said recently in an article. I'll put it up on the screen. Justin Bieber wishes he had abstained from sex before marrying Haley Baldwin. He's found this beautiful woman, his soulmate, his Ruth. And his regret, why didn't I wait? Why didn't I do it God's way? Now, by the way, he's taking an awful lot of heat for making that statement. You should pray for Justin Bieber. He's really trying to live his faith out in a culture that is that wants to oppose him on that. And he's in the limelight. But he believes it would have been better had he done things God's way. Now, you might say, well, it's too late for me. I've already been down that road. It's too late. It's never too late. God is a God of forgiveness. God is a God of grace. God says if you confess your sin to him, he remembers it no more. That means if you go to God and you say, God, I did mess up, but from here on out, I want to do it the right way. I want to do it God's way. God forgives you of that sin, and he forgot that it ever happened. 2 Corinthians 5:17, you know this verse? Anyone in Christ is a new creation. Old things are gone. Behold, all things become new. All things become new. I would love to see a generation of young men and women who say, in their relationships from now on, we're going to do it the right way because God's way is always best. Let's go back to the story. So she sleeps at his feet. She gets up early. She leaves. Now this is just so sweet. She's about to leave, and Boaz says, wait, I have something for you. So she comes back, and he says, oh, hold out your tunic. So she holds out her tunic like this, and he puts 6 portions of barley into her tunic for her to take home as a gift. Isn't that romantic? Hey, listen, if you're starving, that's the most romantic thing you can do. But he gives her all this grain, and it is for her, obviously, and for her mother-in-law, and to show Naomi, I'm serious about this woman. I want to take care of her. Now, there's a little bit of worry here. This is the part in the movie, in the Hallmark movie, where all things look lost. Like, it's the part where you think it's all going to fall apart. And I love what Ruth says to Naomi, or Naomi says to Ruth in verse 18. She says, don't worry, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. Okay, she's like, don't worry, you've got him. He is hooked. It was the 6 portions of barley where I knew he was hooked. Because obviously, Ruth is like, what's going to happen? Well, the hiccup in the story is that because Boaz wanted to do it the right way, he realized he's actually not first in line as the Redeemer. There's actually somebody closer in the lineage that has access to Ruth. So Boaz has got to figure this out. And Ruth is a little worried because she obviously loves him. So he goes into town to meet with the Redeemer, the one who's closer. And he says, okay, well, there's a woman. Her name is Naomi. She's related. Her husband is related to you. She's come back in the land. She wants to sell her land, and you as the Redeemer have the right to purchase it. And the guy says, all right, I'll redeem it. I'll redeem it. Fine, no problem. And then Boaz says, but there's a woman that comes with the deal too, her daughter-in-law. You're going to have to marry her too. Now, you notice in the story, Boaz doesn't go into detail about what an awesome woman she is. He just says there's some baggage attached to the deal. And the man says, oh, well, forget it. I don't want it then. Go ahead, Boaz. You can redeem it. I feel like Boaz at this point suppressed a smile a mile wide. And he says, okay. And he does this in front of all of the elders and all of the people. I'm going to put this up on the screen so we can read it. It's a long section, or longer section. Ruth chapter 4, verse 13 through 17. So this is after they decided it was all going to be good and they married. It says, so Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, remember Naomi who was bitter, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. Who's he talking to? He's talking about the baby, to Naomi. restorer of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now this is important, and I get goosebumps when I talk about this. Their son is the grandfather of King David. Now, what's important about the Davidic lineage in the Bible? Well, it leads all the way down to who? Jesus Christ. God takes a widowed Moabite woman, a woman who doesn't even start her life by worshiping him, and he weaves this story of glory and grace into her life and gives her everything she dreamed about and makes her a part of the greatest story of redemption ever. And that's the story that you and I are a part of as well. Without her story, without her faithfulness, there's no Messiah, there's no salvation, there's no redemption. Her story plays into the greatest story that you and I enjoy today as we sit here. So how do you fit in? Sometimes you might feel like Naomi. I know I do, resentful. God, why did you let this happen to me? Sometimes you're Ruth and you're resilient. I would like to be like that more often. I would like to have that so that my reputation goes out and people go, oh yeah, that's the guy. He doesn't give up. He sticks close to you. That's what we all want. And we would all like to be like Boaz, respectful, doing things the right way, doing things God's way. But probably the best way to see ourselves in this story is in the picture of redemption. Understand this. Boaz is the kinsman redeemer, but he's just a picture of things to come. He is a foreshadowing of our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. Jesus is the Redeemer. And you and I are like Ruth. We're standing outside of this covenant relationship. We have no hope. And on our own, we're left to despair. And we have this choice then to go to Jesus and to ask him to place the covering of his protective wings over us. We have the opportunity to ask him to place the protective covering of his blood over us so that we enter into the family of God in the exact way that Ruth entered into Boaz's family and into the lineage of Christ. Now, while many of us that are here are already believers, I presume, and many that are watching are already believers, I don't want to assume that everybody is. Maybe you're sitting here, you've never heard this story. You've never realized the impact of what it means to be redeemed. Ruth went from having nothing to having everything. Even when it looked impossible, God was working a plan for the better. God's doing that in your life right now. But if you don't know him, the first step is to call upon Jesus and ask him to redeem you. And that's not a difficult thing. You can do that in your own heart by simply admitting to Jesus Christ that you have sinned, admitting that you're a sinner, and asking him to take over in your life, to be your Lord and Savior. Ruth submitted to Boaz, saying, I can't provide for myself, I'm helpless. You and I are helpless on our own too. We're helplessly lost to sin. But today you can know Jesus as your Redeemer so that you can be brought into the family of God, free from death and free from sin. And it would be my prayer that you would do that today. Let me close in prayer.